Christianity is the one religion that you're allowed to despair.
You know what is the one piece of material I would actually rather know at this point than the contents of the Epstein files? Is the 25 minutes that were cut from Stanley Kubrick's Eyes Wide Shut.
It's like, you're making this film, and the idea was that we're all responsible for this, that his sacrifice was for all mankind.
3 men, 3 stories, and one thread running through all of them that Hollywood, the media, and the gatekeepers of culture have spent decades trying to cut. A filmmaker who bet everything on a story he was warned to abandon. A comedian who walked into a party that looked exactly like a movie and later realized the movie was real life. And a dead director whose final film was altered after his death, whose missing 24 minutes may contain what powerful people never wanted the public to see. But here's what nobody is connecting. Let's start where this story actually begins, not in a podcast studio, not in a Hollywood boardroom, but in a garden, in darkness, with a man on his knees sweating drops of blood while the people closest to him fell asleep. That's the opening of The Passion of the Christ. And if you think you already understand what that film was about, Mel Gibson believes you missed the entire point. When Gibson sat down with Joe Rogan, not as a director promoting a project, not as a celebrity doing press, but as a man who still seemed to be wrestling with the weight of something unfinished, the conversation moved fast into territory that at most interviews never reach. Gibson didn't talk about box office numbers. He didn't talk about awards. He talked about why he made the film in the first place. And the answer wasn't what most people expected.
It was like, you're making this film, and the idea was that we're all responsible for this, that his sacrifice was for all mankind.
We're all responsible. That's not a marketing line. That's a theological claim, one that Gibson spent years sitting with before he ever pointed a camera at it. He went back to the 4 Gospels. He dove into ancient texts and theological sources. He pulled from early church writings or from historians outside the Bible, figures like Tacitus and Josephus, first century Roman and Jewish historians who documented the execution of Jesus under Pontius Pilate and confirmed the existence of early Christian communities. This was not mythology to Gibson. This was recorded history, and he wanted the film to feel exactly like that, like history, not tradition, not doctrine, not the comfortable stained glass version the world had absorbed over 2,000 years. He wanted it raw. He wanted it visceral. He wanted it to grab you by the collar and refuse to let go. And the first decision that made studio executives go cold, the first warning sign that this was not going to be a normal Hollywood production, was the language. Gibson chose to film entirely in Aramaic and Latin, ancient Aramaic, the everyday language of first century Judea, the language spoken in markets, in homes, in synagogues, and Latin, the language of Roman imperial authority, the language of occupation. This was not a stylistic stunt. This was a deliberate act of historical restoration. When audiences hear Jesus speak in Aramaic, a language nobody in the modern world grew up with, a language with no pop culture association, no comfort, something happens in the brain. The familiarity disappears, the inherited cultural cushion gets stripped away, and suddenly what you're watching doesn't feel like a religious tradition you've absorbed passively since childhood. It feels like something that actually happened, something foreign and old and real. Even reading subtitles forces participation. You cannot drift. You cannot check out. You must remain present. And that presence was the entire point. Joe Rogan, for his part, immediately recognized the financial courage that decision required. To make a film in ancient languages with graphic violence and no major studio backing from a conventional business standpoint, this was career suicide. Or at least, that's what everyone told Gibson. Here is where the story gets interesting in a way that extends far beyond filmmaking. When Gibson began developing The Passion of the Christ, he ran into something he had never experienced before, not in the same concentrated, coordinated way. Studios went cold, phone calls went unanswered, meetings that should have been guaranteed, given that Gibson was an Oscar-winning director at the height of his career, were canceled. Colleagues who had worked alongside him for years quietly started putting distance between themselves and the project. The message was clear, without anyone having to say it out loud. This story was not welcome, and neither was the filmmaker trying to tell it.
Because there's resistance, first of all, from secular Hollywood, where for whatever reason, Christianity is the one religion that you're allowed to despair.
Gibson noticed a pattern. Films exploring other religious traditions, other spiritual histories, other cultural mythologies received careful handling from the industry, nuanced portrayals, respectful treatment. But when it came to Christian stories, specifically stories that didn't soften, sanitize, or domesticate the claims at their center, the response was different. Skepticism, dismissal, sometimes outright hostility. Projects were labeled old-fashioned, too serious, out of touch with modern audiences. The assumption spoken openly by executives who should have known better was that nobody wanted to see this kind of content anymore. But Gibson refused to walk away. His Catholic upbringing meant this wasn't professional ambition alone, it was a personal mission. When traditional funding dried up, he financed the film himself. He assembled a team of people who believed in the project and weren't intimidated by the pressure surrounding it. What emerged from that crucible shocked the industry that had tried to bury it. The Passion of the Christ, made for roughly $30 million, went on to gross over $600 million worldwide. It became one of the highest-grossing R-rated films in cinema history, proving definitively that millions of people were hungry for exactly the kind of uncompromising storytelling that Hollywood executives insisted nobody wanted. But the financial numbers aren't even the most important part of what Gibson revealed to Rogan. The most important part was what happened on set. Jim Caviezel was cast as Jesus, and from the beginning, his experience on the production was unlike anything recorded in conventional filmmaking. The cross he carried during the crucifixion scenes weighed over 30 pounds. Like, during one take, it dislocated his shoulder completely. During the scourging sequence, he was struck by actual whips, twice one blow so hard, it knocked the wind from his lungs and left his hands bleeding. His pain was not performance, it was real. And that reality bleeds through every frame.
The Passion, well, was struck by lightning on the last shot of the movie. But prior to that, it was shoulder dislocation.
Lightning. Assistant director John Michelini was struck by lightning twice during filming. Caviezel himself was reportedly struck during the crucifixion scene and walked away unharmed. The crew couldn't explain it, and it wasn't isolated. A young girl with severe epilepsy spent time on set during production and reportedly went an entire month without a single seizure. Others reported restored senses. Whether these are understood as divine interventions, remarkable coincidences, or psychological transformations, the people who were there walked away convinced they had participated in something larger than a film production. And then there was Luca Lionello, the actor cast as Judas Iscariot, who entered production as an atheist. By the time filming wrapped, he had become a believer. The set of The Passion of the Christ appeared to be transforming the people on it, as if the story itself was doing something to everyone near it. Gibson also revealed to Rogan that he had warned Caviezel beforehand that playing this role could affect his career, that certain portrayals carry weight that outlasts the production, that choosing to embody a sacred narrative this explicitly, this unflinchingly, comes with consequences that the industry doesn't forgive easily. The warning wasn't discouragement, it was honesty. And it proved accurate. Like, here's the thing that most audiences missed about The Passion of the Christ, and it's the thing that Gibson kept returning to in his conversation with Rogan, with the persistence of someone whose message never quite landed the way he intended. The brutality was not the story, it was the cost of the story. The film's opening scene, before any soldier appears, before any violence begins, takes place in the Garden of Gethsemane, in darkness, in silence, in prayer. Jesus kneels alone while the people closest to him sleep. Then, in Gibson's portrayal, Satan appears not roaring, not theatrical, but slithering through shadows, whispering. A serpent emerges, and Jesus crushes it beneath his heel. A direct callback to the very first promise of redemption recorded in Genesis. Gibson's depiction of evil in this film is deliberately restrained. No dramatic villain, no exaggerated horror. Instead, a calm, observing, quietly poisonous presence. Because Gibson understood something that most filmmakers don't dare to commit to, that the greatest battles are not visible to the crowd. They happen in silence, in gardens, in the space between surrender and resolve. The crucifixion that follows, as brutal as it is, as historically accurate as Gibson insisted it needed to be, is not something imposed on an unwilling victim. It is something accepted, deliberately, with full awareness of its cost. That distinction transforms the meaning of every blow, and all of it, every scene of suffering, every drop of blood, was always pointing toward one moment that Gibson said audiences consistently underestimated. At the end of The Passion of the Christ, the resurrection appears. It is not dramatic. It does not explode into spectacle. It is quiet, deliberate, a calm emergence from death, as if inviting reflection. rather than demanding reaction. And Gibson told Rogan, that moment is not the epilogue. It is the foundation. Without it, everything that came before is only tragedy. The Apostle Paul wrote that if Christ has not been raised, faith itself is empty. The resurrection is not an optional addition to the story. It is the event upon which everything else stands or collapses. This is what Gibson believes audiences missed. They left the theater overwhelmed by the brutality. Some were transformed, some were disturbed. Almost nobody was neutral, but many left thinking the film was about suffering. Gibson made a film about reversal, and now after years of development with screenwriter Randall Wallace, he is preparing to complete what the first film began. Who dies for something they know is a lie? That question, directed at Rogan, directed at the audience, directed at anyone who treats the resurrection as mythology rather than history, is Gibson's central argument. The apostles didn't recant. Every single one of them died rather than deny what they claimed to have witnessed. And Gibson's position is simple. That level of commitment is not consistent with knowing you're lying. Rogan, for his part, did not dismiss it. He sat with it, because that's actually a serious historical argument, not a religious one, a human one. What do you do with people who accept death rather than walk back a claim? And it was in the space of that question that the conversation between Rogan and Gibson began to move into territory that connected directly to something far darker. Joe Rogan has said, publicly and plainly, that there is one piece of information he wants more than the contents of the Epstein files. The 24 minutes cut from Stanley Kubrick's Eyes Wide Shut.
Know what is the one piece of material I would actually rather know at this point than the contents of the Epstein files is the 25 minutes that were cut from Stanley Kubrick's Eyes Wide Shut.
Now, hold that thought, because what Rogan is describing is not a film theory, it's a pattern. The same pattern Mel Gibson identified in Hollywood, the double standard, the institutional gatekeeping, the coordinated resistance to certain stories, Rogan is identifying it in a completely different context, and the overlap is not a coincidence. Stanley Kubrick spent years preparing every film he made. He was not impulsive, he was obsessive, he researched subjects so deeply that he frequently knew more about them than acknowledged experts.